This episode of Trifles is made possible by listeners like you who support us on Patreon and Substack. To learn more, go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the stockbroker clerked, Lady Frances Carfax disappeared, and Bruce Partington planned, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever wondered what a commissionaire does? Or what a compositor is? Or of the difference between a stevedore and a stoker?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 442. A Second Case of Identity. The Second Mrs. Watson. Well, hello, and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast, where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
Are you the second Burt Wolder?
I am actually the rare second edition Burt Wolder with the misprint.
Oh, I second that.
Yeah. I have a staple where the biography is supposed to be. Ow!
Well, I can't wait to see your errata sheet.
I love errata sheets. They're so erotic.
Well,
erotical.
the errata, and nah, I'm not even going to go there. This is one of our...
I was always interested in Eros, but for a long time, particularly when I was a kid, I thought that's how you spelled eraser. So I wound up having a lot of problems. Teachers correcting my spelling and me putting it back the way it was.
You shot an Eros into the air. Well, this episode is one of our Mr. Sherlock Holmes the Theorist episodes where we look at a piece of old Sherlockian scholarship, we bring it to the fore, and we discuss it here with you. It's our way of introducing people to how other Sherlockians have addressed certain trifling issues, how they themselves have entered the world of Sherlockian scholarship. And it's a great way to share some stuff that might not otherwise be apparent to the average listener or viewer or reader. So stay with us here as we prepare for this episode. If you would like to support our show, we do encourage that. A couple of ways to do it. You can do it on Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/trifles, or you can support us on Substack at trifles.substack.com. You can listen to us on either one of those platforms. We do have an audio feed there where you get the show without an ad interruption. And if you support the show at any level, you automatically get entered for a chance to win every month for a random drawing that we do for a back issue of the Baker Street Journal. Speaking of Sherlockian scholarship. So it's a great way to help us keep the show going and to have some fun while you're at it, and maybe learn something along the way. Well, Bert, we are finding ourselves this time in an old publication called the Baker Street Miscellanea. This was published in the early to mid 1980s or so. We're looking at Baker Street Miscellanea number 43 from the autumn of 1985. Specifically at an article by David L. Hammer called A Second Case of Identity, The Second Mrs. Watson. So just to frame it for folks before we dive into Hammer's discussion here, what's the big deal with a second Mrs. Watson? We hear the BSI annually has a toast to the second Mrs. Watson at its dinner. What's this all about?
Well, there's a couple of big deals here. I'll get to the second Mrs. Watson in a second. I just wanted to tell our listeners two things. One is about the Baker Street Miscellanea. Now, this, as you say, this is published in the 80s. The Baker Street Miscellanea began in the mid 1970s, and it really was a terrific Sherlockian publication that focused on the Sherlock Holmes canon as a body of literature. And so the whole idea was serious study and analysis of the canon. And people like John Lullenberg wrote a lot for this, but also Andrew Malick wrote some fundamental things about Freddie Steele, the early research about Frederick Dorr Steele. And it was a really unique journal. And the second thing is David Hammer. We have mentioned David Hammer before, particularly on I Hear of Sherlock.com. David died in around 2018. He was a prominent attorney. He was a major contributor to Sherlockian scholarship. He was an American lawyer, and he wrote some travel guides and things like that. And he's produced this essay, A Second Case of Identity, The Second Mrs. Watson. And the deal here, to your question about what's all this about the second Mrs. Watson, is that in the cases of Sherlock Holmes, Watson tells us some things about his personal life, his private life. We know he fell deeply in love rather rapidly with Mary Morstan, and the sign of four ends with him marrying Mary Morstan. And then later on, when Holmes returns from the great hiatus, Watson notes that Holmes somehow became aware of what he describes as his sad bereavement. So we deduce from that, or infer from that, that Mary Morstan is the bereavement, but even that's been questioned. And then Watson goes back to Baker Street, and then somewhere along the line he mentions his wife, chronologically inconsistent with the departure of Mary Morstan. And so who was the second Mrs. Watson? And was there a third Mrs. Watson, or a fourth, or a fifth, or what's going on here? And so that's the background here. And David Hammer now has an opinion as to who this second Mrs. Watson really was.
Oh, does he ever? And just by way of reference, we did an episode on Dr. Watson's marriages. In episode 318, we discussed what was going on there. That was back in season 7. I think that was in February. It was National Wedding Month. So we decided to celebrate by going through all of Watson's marriages, up to 6 in some cases. But as you say, David Hammer brings us just to number 2. And he opens, I love this opening, the counseled gulf between deduction and speculation is nowhere more evident than in the exegetic writings about the second and various Mrs. Watsons. There are some verities, not many, but enough. We know Watson married Mary Morstan, and this is just as you outlined, Bert, probably in 1888. She died prior to April 1894, and that Watson remarried sometime in 1903, or perhaps shortly before. This much we have on the authority of the canon. These data are solid and incontrovertible, but beyond these boundaries, there's a dark and unknown land. Who was the second Mrs. Watson, and was there a third or even fifth, as suggested by Trevor Hall? Are all questions put and posed as part of those delightful disputations, usually requiring a third or fourth round to find some common area of disagreement. Minutia, yes, but marvelous stuff.
While the possibility of a third or more Mrs. Watson exists theoretically, it cannot be established. This, however, has not daunted Holmesians from extensively theorizing as to her identity. We do have canonical authority as to a second Mrs. Watson, and speculation remains as to her name. She, says David, has been variously and ingeniously identified as Violet de Merville by S.C. Roberts and disputed by T.S. Blakeney, Irene Adler by J.N. Williamson, Miss Z by Trevor Hall, and Mary Watson a second time around by Daniel L. Moriarty, and the pseudonymous Miss Jane Nightwork, which was Christopher Morley.
Yeah, and here Hammer does a great job of footnoting all of these, And he mentioned, as you said back in the beginning of that paragraph, extensively theorizing as to her identity. He said, from George Haynes, who sought to confirm Christopher Morley's identification of Lady Frances Carfax as the putative third Mrs. Watson, to Elmer Davis, who postulated a daughter of Mrs. Cecil Forrester, and to A. Carson Simpson, who argued for Mrs. Forrester herself. And he's got all of these sources annotated, from the Sherlock Holmes Journal to the Baker Street Journal to Vincent Sterrett's 221B Studies in Sherlock Holmes to leaves from the Copper Beeches. So lots of great old publications are out there with the many theories of the many Mrs. Watsons.
Well, and then now David takes us to his presumption here, and it really is a presumption. So after all of that review in the footnotes and so on, he says, it is respectfully submitted that the second Mrs. Watson was, in the current and unfortunate parlance of academe, none of the foregoing. The good doctor's second spouse was named Violet, but she was not de Merville, but Hunter.
What?
Indeed, the frequency with which that Christian name appears in the canon suggests the correctness of both attributions. Now, let's just pause here for a moment. Before we even finish David's sentence.
Yes.
What he said is, here's the deal, he says, with no evidence. The good doctor's second spouse was named Violet, but not de Vermel, but Hunter. Indeed, the frequency with which that Christian name appears in the canon suggests the correctness of both attributions. So because the name Violet appears a couple of times, anyway.
Well, there's 4 Violets in the canon.
Yeah, no waiting. Right. 4 Violets, no waiting.
4 Violets, no waiting. Yeah. Well, so he only calls out 2 of them here, though. That's the thing.
Well, that's true. That's true.
There's Violet Hunter, right? Violet de Merville.
Right.
Violet Smith, and Violet Bruce
Leibowitz.
Bartington Westbury, right?
Oh, right. I guess so.
Is that her name? Violet Westbury? I think it is.
Perhaps someday, David says, Michael Harrison, don't hold your breath, will lend his considerable linguistic talents to determine the significance of the repeated use of the enigmatic and ubiquitous cognomen.
Well, and I should note that we do have an episode on the 4 Violets, episode 291, if you want to go back and listen to that. Hammer says that he's been unable thus far to find any published suggestion that Violet Hunter was the second occupant of the Watson connubial bed. Yeah, go figure. In fact, apparently, the only interest which she's generated is an early and entertaining article by Isaac S. George entitled Violet the Hunter, which was in the Copper Beeches. He doesn't say where that was from. Isaac George. The gravamen of which was, as evidenced by the title, she stalked Mr. Sherlock Holmes. He doesn't say what that's from. The Hunter 13. Actually, no, that should be 12. He's got his footnotes wrong here. So that's from the Baker Street Journal, January of 1949, volume 4, number 1. Sorry about that. But what's the evidence within the canon to any Watsonian interest in La Belle Hunter? Note in his initial description of her, he says, she was plainly but neatly dressed, with a bright, quick face, freckled like a plover's egg, and with the brisk manner of a woman who has her own way to make in the world. This is high praise from the Victorian age. Plain, neat, bright, brisk, all approbatory terms from a man like Watson. But freckled like a plover's egg? For a Scotsman, in this is a significant simile. It's the simile of a man more than cursorily interested in this lady.
Watson was in the vanguard of his time. A new breed of woman was emerging, as is she still. Now, David, of course, is writing here. What year is this? This is
85.
85. But, as is she still, but more significantly, she was being accepted in her new role, the wage earner who was neither servant nor governess. The new symbol was the typewriter. No, not the machine, but the operator, for that was what she was called and was her proud title. These ladies were brisk and businesslike. They had to be, for they supplanted the men who first operated the typing machines. Watson obviously admired the qualities of the new woman. Note his observation at the end of the first interview. "At least," said I, as we heard her quick, firm steps descending the stairs, "she seems to be a young lady who is well able to take care of herself."
Quick, determined, capable, self-reliant, all qualities which Watson appreciated. And her courage and resolve were underscored by her quiet statement, "That is the letter which I have just received, Mr. Holmes, and my mind is made up that I will accept it." Accept it she did, and all was well until that brief and urgent telegram summoning Holmes to the Black Swan Hotel in Winchester, which was signed imperially, "Hunter." "Will you come with me?" asked Holmes, glancing up. Well, the doctor's response probably stepped on Holmes's inquiry. "I should wish to." Indeed he would. Watson, already smitten in his gentlemanly and Doylean way, would have insisted, for here was a lonely woman in distress, and a knight-errant was required. Miss Hunter was a real heroine, quite deserving of Holmes's observation that she was a quite exceptional woman. A game lady. Her response to Holmes's request that she do one more thing was immediate. "I will try. What is it?" No equivocation, no subterfuge, no inquiry until after the commitment. Some woman. Who can blame the poor smitten Watson? Remember his sad words in the last sentence of the adventure? "As to Miss Violet Hunter, rather to my disappointment, Holmes manifested no further interest in her, once she had ceased to be the center of one of his problems."
Sad words indeed, and passing strange, you may say. If he was enamored of Miss Hunter, perhaps it is the strongest evidence that he did not really care. But he did care, so much so that he wanted his best friend and mentor to be the bridegroom. Remember, Watson was then married to Mary Watson, née Morstan, for this was 1890, or the latest, 1891 in terms of the chronology. Like Doyle, Watson was the veriest of Victorian gentlemen, and it was unthinkable that he would adopt what Bernard Berenson termed the Western custom of one wife and hardly any mistresses. Doyle and Watson, facing the same dilemma, reacted quite predictably in the same manner. For each, there was one wife at a time and no mistresses, despite the unintended blandishments of a Violet Hunter or a Jean Leckie, writes David. Yet even a gentleman did not deny himself post-Copper Beech's knowledge of Miss Hunter, and indeed Watson did not, all of which was further evidence of his undiminished interest in her. Also, as he mentioned at the conclusion of the episode, she is now the head of a private school at Wassall, where I believe she has met with considerable success.
I think that's a typo on David's part. I think it was Walsall.
Oh, that's right, Walsall.
Yeah.
You're right.
The adventure was written up in June 1892, and Watson's sad bereavement wouldn't necessarily have occurred after that date, but before Holmes's return in 1894. The next fixed and certain date in Watson's matrimonial endeavors was January 1903, when Holmes observed that the good Watson at the time had deserted me for a wife, the only selfish action which I can recall in our association. And that's from The Blanched Soldier. And the accuracy of this month and year has been accepted with rare unanimity by chronologists Zeisler, Bell, Christ, Baring Gould, and Brend. So why there existed a 9-year hiatus between poor Mary's death and Watson's remarriage, well, we shall probably never know. Perhaps it was the consequence of a woman's inhibitions or her independence of spirit, or perhaps she was too fastidious for marriage. Most likely it required that amount of time for Watson to summon up the blood and stiffen the sinews. But married they ultimately were, and there was a good likelihood that it was a good one which lasted, despite the folk wisdom that married men make the poorest husbands.
What? Watson brought to the marriage two self-acknowledged traits which separately augur well for a good spousal relationship, but which in combination are synergistic. First, he recognized that he was one of the most long-suffering of mortals. And second, and more significantly, he acknowledged that by long experience, I had learned the wisdom of obedience.
Well, what do you think? Has David Hammer made the case for the second Mrs. Watson being Violet Hunter?
No. No. But it's interesting for the little window it gives you on culture here, I mean, for good for David for noting, in the time he was writing, the characteristic of repositioning the role of women in society. But he's completely sort of slipped over the fact that she was supposed to be running a private school. And maybe the idea of giving all that up and, worrying about Watson's relationship with Sherlock Holmes back in London was probably not her idea of a great thing.
Go figure.
Yeah. Hard to believe, but maybe.
Oh, my goodness, women as independent thinkers.
Yeah, personally, it's clear to me that Watson's second wife was Mrs. Turner, who had, clearly an extensive real estate portfolio, because she at one point was owning Baker Street, but that's something else.
That's just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
What a very attractive woman.
Was she? I hadn't noticed.